Okay, welcome back to Principles of Micro with James Bland. Today we're going to be learning about international trade. But before we make a start on that, what I'd like to do is just do a quick refresh of what's in Mankiw's Principles of Micro Chapter 3, which is comparative advantage. Okay, so in this chapter, we learned about a production possibility frontier. No, not labeling this with price and quantity. Let's think about having good X on the horizontal axis and good Y on the vertical axis. And then we can have two countries, each with different production possibility frontiers. Okay, so let's call this country A, and call this one country B. And the important feature of these production possibility frontiers is that they have different slopes. Okay, and this is what's going to help us work out, well, which country will be exporting and importing which goods. Okay, and so what we can see here is that country B has a relatively flat production possibility frontier. And so that means that they give up less Y when they want to produce more X. Okay, so if we think about this, if we want to produce one more unit of X, country B does not have to give up that much Y. Okay, whereas if country A wants to give up, wants to produce some more good X, they have to give up a lot of good Y. Okay, so country B has the comparative advantage in producing good X, which necessarily means that country A has the comparative advantage in producing good Y. Okay, so trade is going to be beneficial in our market setting for exactly the same reason that trade is beneficial in our production possibility frontier setting. Okay, so we're going to have a country that has, well, there are going to be some goods for which the local country has the comparative advantage in producing that good, and there are other situations where it does not. And as a whole, the country can benefit from trade because it allows producers to focus on what they have comparative advantage on, and it allows consumers to buy goods from producers overseas who have comparative advantage in producing that good, where locally the producers do not. Okay, so let's see how this fits in to our supply and demand model. Okay, so here are here's quantity and price. Here is supply, here is demand, but we need to be a little bit more specific about what these supply and demand curves are referring to. Up to this point, we've just assumed that there is a market for this good, but now there are really two markets. There is a local market, right? As a consumer, I can buy something from a local producer, or I can buy something on the international market, right? I can buy an imported good. And as a seller, I can sell my good locally, or I can sell it internationally, right? I can export it. Okay, so specifically, we're going to think about, well, these supply and demand curves are going to refer to, well, the demand curve is going to just describe the behavior of local consumers, and the supply curve is just going to describe the behavior of local producers. Okay, so these supply and demand curves are just going to describe what's happening in the local market. Okay, now that's going to be really important, and I want you to keep this not too far in the back of your mind when we get to assessing the total surplus of opening up markets to international trade, because the supply and demand curves here are just describing the benefits and costs associated with trades that happen, trades that involve at least one local producer or one local consumer. Okay, so we're going to begin by studying a case. So let's assume that the local country, right? So if you're living in the US, this would be the US, does not have comparative advantage in this good, in producing this good. Okay, so what this means is that there are producers overseas that can produce this good at a lower opportunity cost. Okay, so if we think about this diagram as we have it drawn at the moment, describing what would happen if we could not trade with other countries, this would be our domestic quantity, right? The quantity, right, finish writing that word, the quantity that would be traded in a market that is not opened up to international trade. And then we'd have our domestic price up here. Okay. Now, if the local country does not have comparative advantage in producing excuse me, my OneNote decided to crash on me at that point. Anyway, so if this is a market for a good that the US does not have the comparative advantage in producing, then necessarily means that there are producers overseas that can produce this good at a lower cost. Okay, so what we're going to assume is that, to make things simpler, there are two markets. There's a local market, right? As a consumer, I can buy the good from a local producer, and as a producer, I can sell the good to a local consumer, but there's also an international market, and the simplifying assumption we're going to make here is that that international market is so large that nothing that happens in the local market is going to affect the price on the international market. Okay, so that means that the international price is just going to be a horizontal line on our diagram, right? So this is here our international price. Excuse me, let's write that up properly. Okay, so as a, I'm going to move to a different color here. As a local consumer, I now have access to this international market, right? I don't just have to buy from a local producer. Okay, so I could buy from a local producer, but obviously I wouldn't want to pay the domestic price anymore, right? I could buy the good at the domestic price, but I can now buy things internationally, right? I can import goods, I can buy from someone overseas, and I can access this price here, okay? So I would never want to pay anything more than the international price, okay? As a seller, I am now not able to sell at the domestic price because no consumer anywhere would want to buy it from me, right? Consumers locally know they can buy anything at the international price. Sellers know that they can't sell their good overseas for more than the international price because, well, there's that international price out there that they're competing with. And so what this means is that the international price now pins down the price consumers pay and the price sellers receive when we've opened up the market to international trade. Okay, so if this red line here, the international price, is the price consumers pay, then that means that consumers are going to want to buy this much, right? Quantity demanded with international trade. Okay, now sellers aren't so happy about this, right? The price sellers receive because they can't sell their goods for more than the international price is now going to be the international price. So the quantity that they want to sell is now going to be the intersection with, well, as usual, the supply curve and the price sellers receive, which is now here, right? So this is quantity with international trade supplied. Okay, so what you'll notice here is that quantity supplied with international trade is less than quantity demanded with international trade. In Chapter 4, we would have called this a shortage, but actually this difference in quantity supplied and quantity demanded is not a shortage because consumers are actually buying this amount, right? This difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied with international trade is the imports. Right, so we have domestic production and imports. Okay, so just to finish up with this example where the local country does not have the comparative advantage in this good, let's think about the prices that consumers and producers are facing now compared to what they'd get if they could not trade with an international market. I say, okay, so the price consumers pay is less than the domestic price. Right, so that must make consumers happy, right? Because I can buy things on the international market and they're cheaper than what they would be if they were produced locally and the international market was not something that we could access. Consumers must be better off, right? They're buying more stuff at lower prices, okay? But this is obviously going to be bad for sellers, right? The price sellers receive is less than the domestic price. So sellers are not so happy, okay? Because they have to compete with the domestic market now, they can only sell their, because they have to compete with the international market, they can only sell their good at the international price, and so here they're selling less stuff at lower prices. Okay, so this is the situation where the country does not have comparative advantage in producing the good, and so the question now is, well, what about for a good where they do have comparative advantage in producing the good? Okay, so we're going to be thinking about now the other situation which we know must happen, because if you don't have comparative advantage in producing one good, then there must be a good out there for which the local country has comparative advantage. Okay, so here's our supply and demand diagram. Okay, and again, remember these, the sellers that are represented by this supply curve are going to just be local sellers. And by the same argument, the demand curve here is just going to represent local consumers. Okay, so we're going to have an international price here that now must be above the domestic price. So I probably should have labeled those beforehand. Sorry, use my usual notation here. Here is the domestic price, sorry, the domestic quantity and the domestic price. Okay, and now we have an international market that people can access, but no one on the international market has comparative advantage in producing this good, because the comparative advantage for producing this good exists in the local country. Okay, so that means that the international price must be something like this, right? It must be above the domestic price. Okay, so here is our international price. Okay. Now let's think about what consumers and producers will want to be doing in this situation. Okay, so as a local producer, there's no way I'm going to want to sell my good at the domestic price, because I could always send it overseas and get this international price, which is higher, right? Why would I sell my good at a lower price when I know I can sell as much as I like on this, well, assumed to be very large international market? Okay, so the price sellers receive is going to be the international price. But now consumers know that sellers would never want to sell at the domestic price to them anymore. So if they want to buy the good, they've got to pay the international price as well, right? So the price sellers receive and the price consumers pay must both be the international price. Okay, so let's think about what this means for quantity demanded locally and quantity supplied. Okay, so here we have well, we know what the price sellers receive is going to be, and so that's going to pin down the quantity supplied, right? So here's the intersection of the price sellers receive and the supply curve. So local producers are going to sell this much. So this is quantity supplied when we have international trade. And by the same argument, the quantity demanded with international trade is going to be the intersection of the price consumers pay and the demand curve, which is over here. We go down to our horizontal axis, and here is our quantity demanded with international trade. Okay, so in Chapter 4, that's Chapter 4 of Mankew's Principles of Micro, we look at this and say quantity supplied international market is greater, well, with international trade, is greater than quantity demanded with international trade, and we call that a surplus, right? Sellers are selling more than buyers are wanting to buy, but in this situation, sellers are wanting to sell more than what buyers are wanting to buy, but the difference here is that sellers are actually selling this, right? They are selling this, just not to domestic consumers. And so this difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is going to be our exports. Excuse me, I should probably spell that correctly if I can. Good. Okay. So let's think about this, just sort of foreshadowing my next video. We have price sellers receive with an international market is greater than the domestic price. And so that means that sellers are happier, right? They're selling more stuff at a higher price. That can only make sellers happier, assuming their costs haven't changed. Well, the supply curve hasn't moved, so that must be the case. Okay? And the price consumers pay, I mean, these two things are equal, right? Is greater than the domestic price, and so that's made consumers worse off, right? They're buying less stuff at a higher price, and so necessarily they must be worse off. Okay, I'll get to analyzing this from a welfare perspective in the next video. But just think about these situations, and obviously, if the price goes up, that's going to be good for consumers. Good for sellers, and bad for consumers, and vice versa. If the price goes down, that's going to be good for consumers and bad for sellers. But remember that when we open up the market to international trade, what we're getting is an expansion in the industry, like this one here in this diagram, that we have a comparative advantage in. And if we go back up to this previous diagram, which I've sadly destroyed my axes on, we get a contraction in this industry where we don't have a comparative advantage, right? So what we're doing is we're reallocating production from somewhere that we're not so good at doing, for something that we're not so good at doing, right? So there'll be, jobs, people will lose their jobs in whatever sector this is, but then there'll be a whole lot more employment in this sector. And so, I mean, it's not clear whether this is going to be good or bad for particular workers or particular consumers, but overall, we're reallocating production in a way that makes our production more efficient. Okay, we're producing the stuff that we have comparative advantage in, and we're consuming goods that are produced by producers that also have comparative advantage in that good, whether they are local or international. Okay, so I'm going to leave this here, and in the next video we will talk about how this all relates to total surplus. Okay, so thanks very much. I'm James Bland, and I will see you later.